Welcome to the Earthworks Podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Simmons, and this is the Earthworks Podcast. I'm very excited to have back with us Mr. Pat Finlen, who many of you in the golf course industry knows. I think I have as much respect for Pat as anybody in this industry. I've known you for a long time. We have way too many stories that we can't share. But Pat has changed his career pattern a little bit in the last couple of years, leaving the golf course superintendent world, and now is working as the executive vice president at the Denehy Club Thinking Partners and is doing recruiting and staffing work. So I guess the first question is, how the hell are you? How's things going?
Well, I'm doing great and loving what I'm doing.
So how's the transition been from growing grass and managing teams of growing grass to, I mean, this is probably one of the big questions a lot of superintendents have, especially as we get to our state in life. How's the transition from getting out of the golf course to now doing something a little bit different?
Well, I actually got out of the growing grass back in 2013 when I became a GM. So I really made that big transition then. So the transition now has been from GM to the recruiting world. And for me, I enjoy it because I always enjoyed hiring people. I always enjoyed attracting good talent, whether it was a superintendent or a GM. So I'm really doing the same thing, but I'm doing it for somebody else. So I get to go visit a lot of great golf courses, meet a lot of great people. It's really been fun.
So you're still traveling a lot, obviously.
Yeah, I love to travel. You know that.
Yes, I do. That's how we hook up a lot. Explain to us, so that folks that don't know Denehy, give us a little background on what Dan set up here and what Denehy's all about.
Well, Dan's been doing this for quite some time. The firm's done about 13 to 1,400 searches, mostly GM searches. But I came on to do some of their superintendent searches. I'm doing one now out in the LA market. I did one in Bermuda back about a year ago.
Yeah.
And most of the other searches I've done have been GM searches. And then I did an RFP for Foxwood Casinos in Connecticut for their 36-hole golf facility to hire a new management company. So it's been a pretty good variation of different types of jobs and different things.
You had Foxwood. You brought in a management company. You recruited them. Is that how that set up?
Well, yeah, they had a management company that had been there for probably 15 years, and they decided to do an RFP, and we handled the RFP, brought in 5 or 6 different management companies to on-site interviews.
Right.
Or we helped them choose. We didn't help them choose; they chose who they wanted, but they got a new management company.
Well, that must have been a little bit different than the normal GM recruiting.
It was. I mean, Indian gaming and golf. I think there's got to be about 50 tribes now that have golf courses throughout the United States, which is a lot. And golf's a big amenity to attract gamblers. So they put a lot of emphasis on golf.
Let me go back a little bit for those, and I can't imagine there's anybody in our industry who doesn't know who you are and your background a little bit, but give us a little background of your career history. And I know we talked about it about a year or so ago when we had you on the podcast, but just refresh our memory. I mean, I got to meet you. I guess I met you at Olympic Club, but you had a stellar career prior to even getting to there.
Well, I started out in Kansas City.
Right.
I was fortunate. It was back when AGF said build a golf course today, and we'll fill it up. And I became an assistant superintendent after being in the landscape business for a couple of years back in 1980.
I remember that.
81 or 82, my brother and I borrowed money. Prime was 19, I think. We borrowed at 22%. And
smart.
And made it 2 years. And I went back to work on a golf course making $5.50 an hour.
Wow.
I think in a month, the assistant left. I became assistant. A year later, the superintendent left, and I became superintendent. Stayed there a couple of years, went to Virginia Beach, Virginia to build a golf course. Stayed there a couple of years, went back to Kansas City to the same course I left, but they put me in charge of, it was a private lake community. So I was in charge of all the roads, the buildings, the sewers, the lake, the golf course, and all the open space. And I really learned a lot about project management and how to manage something bigger than just a golf course.
Yeah.
left there, went to Fort Ord in Seaside, the Monterey area for 3.5 years. And the opening came up at the Olympic Club, and it was actually a member of the club from the recruiting firm that called me. Interviewed for that job, didn't get it. The guy that got it backed out at the last minute. They called me on a Saturday night and said, "Can you be at the club on Sunday morning?" I met with the new GM for 30 minutes. He offered me the job on the spot, and that was it. So
they called you on Saturday night, expecting you to be able to get there the next morning.
The board, the GM and the board was leaving for a board retreat in Hawaii.
So you had no choice.
The GM wanted to close this deal before he got on the plane. So I 30 minutes and I was done.
Yeah.
And spent 17 years at the Olympic Club in 3 different positions.
What was the third position? You were a superintendent GM.
A superintendent for 11 years. In February of 2013, the same month I became president of GCSAA and became director of golf.
Oh, you were director of golf between the okay.
Yes, I was a director of golf for 7 months without a PGA background, so it was kind of an odd position, but I really enjoyed it. I was over the golf shop and all golf operations, which was kind of fun.
Yeah.
And then they fired the GM that year, and I became GM later in the year. So it was interesting career path for me.
And you recently just moved your homestead. I know.
I did after 25 years in California.
Had to get out, did you?
Well, everybody's got to get out sooner or later.
Yeah, I think so.
We moved to Missoula, Montana. I'm a 5th generation to live in Montana.
That's cool.
And I told my wife I wanted to live here my whole career, my whole life since I've met her 40 years ago. And finally, I put in my will that one of my ashes had dropped in a certain river in Montana. And last summer about this time, she goes, "Why don't we just go look at some places?" We went to Boise, Reno, Missoula, and just fell in love with Missoula.
So you're right on the river now. So she can just throw you right in from the backyard, right?
She doesn't have to wait for the ashes. She can just push me over there.
Just throw your body right. Okay, yeah, why wait for ashes? That's
the river's right across the street, so we go down to the river quite a bit.
That must be wonderful. I'm so happy that you found you got back to your home. That's a great story. 5 generations up in that part of the country. That's great.
Yeah, 1887. So
wow. It's like there's a TV show about that, isn't there? Yellowstone or something like that. Is that about your family?
Well, no, they filmed that about 40 miles south of where we live.
Wow, you should go down when the crew's around and hang out for a while.
Well, I have a good friend who caters the set, and he's invited us down, but they're supposed to start filming this month. They didn't because of the writer's strike. It'll be this fall, but we hope to get down there.
Oh, let me know. I'd love to be a hang around for something like that.
Yeah.
I'll fly out and see you guys for that.
I know you, but
yeah. Right. So let's talk about what you're doing because, and it's funny you said what you started with in that you've spent so much time recruiting people for jobs that you needed to work for you. And needless to say, you've had some phenomenal superintendents that I'm aware of anyway, and I'm sure a bunch of other folks that I'm not aware of. But you brought in Troy Flanagan, who we've had here on the podcast. You hired Justin Mandan, a former student of mine, and we've had here on the podcast. I might be missing somebody because I think you had an awful lot of good people go through there. But what's the secret of let's start from a perspective of the superintendent. And you hiring people on the board, and that's kind of what I want to go over with your expertise now and what you're doing at Denehy. Let's talk about how do people find the right people? What's the way to vet them? What are some of the good questions to ask? And start from the perspective of superintendent. And then I want to kind of flip it over to how it's different now that you're recruiting for another organization. But what was your thought process when you were, at Olympic or wherever, and you were hiring people?
Well, I think at Olympic, the hard part there was we had 3 unions, and one union, one union was for just the golfers only. So it took a certain type of person to come in and manage there because most superintendents don't deal with unions. And the first minute when you mention union to somebody, they're shocked. I spoke last week at the Oregon Golf Course Superintendents Association's annual meeting, and Brian Koppler, who was one of my guys at Olympic, is now at Waverly.
Yeah.
And I spoke, and I got Brian to speak up, and Brian said the hardest part for him was when he got to Olympic was because I wanted to get rid of the union in the first month, and Pat told me you can't. You got to learn how to manage around it. So for me, it was hiring people that had some bandwidth to deal with that union aspect, and that was more so Olympic. But I always look for attitude. Somebody's attitude and their demeanor, I think, is really important. At least
Yeah.
for me. For some, it's not. It's purely turf. But I really wanted people that had a great attitude and people that could show some patience and deal with really tough situations.
So how do you vet when you're interviewing somebody, in an hour interview? How do you vet patience?
Well, you start asking questions about, what's the toughest issue you've handled at work, and then you get them to expand upon it. And when somebody tells you, "Well, I really don't have any tough issues at work," there's no way they're being
Right.
truthful.
There's something wrong there, right?
And I learned as GM at the Olympic Club when we would interview senior staff, we'd have three people in the room, and it was usually the HR director, myself, and somebody else. And when one of us is asking a question, the other two people are watching body language, and body language in interviews is great. And so I've even learned with Dan's firm when I'm there, generally there's two of us in the interviews with the search committee.
Right.
And even if I'm by myself and the search committee is asking a candidate questions, I'm watching their body language. And typically when somebody leans back and looks up to the ceiling, they're trying to figure out, they're usually making something up.
Right. They're searching.
They're searching. They want, everybody wants to have the perfect answer. There's really no answer. So, but a lot of it to me is the attitude and demeanor of the candidate and how they react to those questions that you ask them.
That's interesting that you talk about body language because that is really very important. And, like you said, when you're doing one of these things, looking for the writing on the ceiling and, and other little tricks, so, and it's actually fascinating that you've got two other people in the room. You're really focused on body language in the interview process.
It is, people tend to look down. I think they're serious and they're truthful. When they tend to lean back in the chair and they start to look up, or they go like this with their arms crossed, something's going on.
I'll have to remember that.
They're trying to answer the question.
Yeah,
they're either going to lie to you or they're going to try to make up what they think is the perfect answer.
So when they're looking down, what do you think what do you think the body language is there?
I think it's totally different. I think they're being truthful. They're just contemplating the question and coming up with an answer.
Yeah. Or is it insecurity?
I don't think so at all.
Okay.
I think that's more a body language trait of thinking and coming up with the answer.
There's, we run, and I don't mean this to sound critical by any means, but we run into a lot of superintendents that might be a little full of themselves. How do you work around that in an interview, especially, again, interviewing as a superintendent for an assistant's position? I'm trying to give anybody some advice here. I mean, how do you work around somebody that might think a little more of themselves than perhaps they should?
Well, not everybody's a good interviewer.
Right.
To start off, and you got to weed through that to start with. Some people will get in an interview and they just get totally nervous. They can't think on the spot. You get others that are so full of themselves that it just rolls off their tongue about how great all the great things they've done.
Me.
Yeah. Well, it's I or me. Yeah. It's I did this, I did that. I'm looking for the team aspect of it, because almost in every position, whether it's a superintendent, director, golf, GM, you're part of a team.
Yeah.
Whether you're the head person leading the team, and
especially in our business.
Yeah, the higher up you get, and the more, especially as a GM, it's more about creating that team atmosphere and not having that triangular management where you're at the top and everybody else is at the bottom. You're really below them, pushing them up and supporting them.
Is it difficult, or is it a lot different when you're interviewing for an assistant or a superintendent versus, say, a GM or a different type of position? Is the process different for these different levels of position?
Well, we rarely would get an assistant position.
Well, at least when you were a superintendent, though, you were interviewing.
Yeah. I mean, I think with superintendents, superintendents nowadays are way more sophisticated than they've ever been.
Yeah.
I think superintendents are probably one of the most capable to become GMs. I look at those that come out of the food and beverage business, and I mean, if you look at any golf facility, who's the go-to person?
Yeah.
It's the superintendent. I was talking to a guy the other day, interviewing a guy yesterday, and he said we had a tree fall over the tennis court fencing, and I said, "Did they call the tennis pro?" And he goes, "No, they called me." Um, and I said, "Are you in charge of tennis?" And he goes, "No." And we were laughing, and I said, "You know, I think superintendents really are the director of facilities. They take care of everything."
Yeah.
Because
Well,
golf, this is nothing against golf pros or chefs or whatever. They stay in their field, and the superintendent is everywhere. So you look at superintendents nowadays, and I think they're well positioned to become either director of facilities, if they want an enhanced title, or GMs.
yeah. So are you, and now in your new role at Denehy, are you recruiting superintendents for GM positions?
Occasionally we'll get somebody that's interested.
Yeah.
I had a superintendent that came to me, wanted to become a GM, and I placed him in Bermuda as superintendent.
I know that story. Yes.
Yeah, and he's doing a phenomenal job there. But the GM there really wanted a right hand person to work with him
Yeah.
on a $100 million total facility rebuild.
Yeah.
And he's the perfect guy for it. And I think he'll learn a lot of good traits where he can become a GM if he wants to in the future.
Yeah. You and I both know a lot of former superintendents who are now GMs. I mean, I'd refer to our mutual friend Glenn Smickley at the Cow Club, who I think he's just a superstar when it comes to that role. But are there a lot? I mean, are we seeing a lot of superintendents that are interested in moving into that role?
Yeah, a lot of them don't know they're interested in it. I think they become that director of facilities, even though they don't have that title.
Right.
And really, they're the go-to person for everything. I was talking to the superintendent yesterday that I'm trying to recruit for a position, and he goes, and this is the one that the tree fell over the tennis court. He goes, they call me for everything. He goes, the club president calls me now.
So he might as well. Yeah.
He didn't even go through the GM to call me. He just calls me. So I think you're seeing superintendents get in a position now where if they want to become a GM, they're certainly qualified.
Yeah, there's no question about that. It's funny because you talk to a lot of, and this as well better than I do, but I talk to a lot of superintendents, and there's a certain distrust, or I don't want to use the word disdain, but a dislike for the role. So I think a lot of guys that might even entertain it and maybe not even understand, the value of what it could be to their career are kind of shying away just because, they've worked with bad GMs over their careers and the last thing they want to do. I mean, how do you work around that? I mean, I think that's a disservice to themselves because, a lot of guys are talking moving up and that it's really working out well.
Yeah. Well, look at the superintendent position for the last 30 years. It used to be the superintendent was out there spending half the day hands-on doing work.
Cutting grass, yeah.
Most superintendents now have an assistant that's doing almost what they used to do 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So the superintendent role has progressed, and I look at the GM role, and I think it's progressed as well. The old GM 30 years ago had to go out and touch tables every night.
Right.
I had to touch every table in the dining room. Most GMs are not doing that. They're up in that COO, sometimes CEO role, and they've got a food and beverage manager that runs that dining portion of it. And really, it's the GM role has progressed just as much as the superintendent role has. And I think superintendents used to be afraid of being a GM because they didn't like food and beverage.
Yeah.
Superintendents, a good many superintendents say, just leave me alone. I just want to go down to my maintenance facility and work, and I'll do my job and leave.
Yeah.
But even becoming a GM gives you a lot more flexibility than you had as a superintendent. You can pick some of the times you go to work and sometimes you don't go to work.
Yeah.
It's a much more flexible schedule. The other thing is, I think if you're a superintendent and you're 55 and you lose your job, it's hard to find another one. If you're a GM and you get fired at 55, you'll get hired in 2 months.
Yeah.
And the GMs get recirculated so quickly, and the older you get as a GM, the more you're sought after.
Oh, that's interesting. I interviewed, and I don't know if you know Brandon Byrne from Lanark Country Club out in Philly.
I don't.
Brandon, I just interviewed him for the podcast here, and he's actually in the role of co-general manager. So he does the facilities work, whereas there's somebody, there was a woman as GM who ran kind of food and beverage and human resources and all that, which was, I thought, one of the most unique position breakouts that I'd ever heard on a golf course, because he, like you were saying, the superintendent's running the facility anyway. So they actually gave him the title of co-general manager because he deals with all the facilities and to the point of, of building new facilities and arranging for for a gazebo or for a pool house or for redoing pools. So he's not only doing all the golf course work, but he's doing the facilities work, which I think makes perfect sense. And it seems like it would be a much better fit, at least to get somebody in. And one of the comments that he made was, if you have an opportunity to be, to move into a general manager's role, take it. And he was really definitive about that, which I thought was pretty enlightening. And like I said, a lot of superintendents just kind of have this food and beverage idea of what a GM is, folding napkins and making butter patties. And
well, it's entirely different than that. And I mean, look at Dan Mearsman at Philly Cricket.
Yeah.
Dan, they don't have a GM now because Dan is doing all the facilities.
Yeah.
And you're starting to see more and more of that where superintendents say you don't want to be a GM, will lobby to become the facilities director. I've even brought that up to Red Evans at GCS. Said, hey, why not create a new membership category?
Oh, I like that.
You're seeing more and more superintendents do it, and a lot of them are doing it already, even though they don't realize they're doing it.
Or get paid for it, or get notoriety for it. Yeah, exactly.
That's right. And you start.
In that scenario, what happens if you're a facilities manager? Then there's a food and beverage manager, or a human resource manager, or both. Or I mean, they're just equal level managers.
I think a facilities manager at a lot of these places, you're managing everything outside, and sometimes you're in charge of the inside of the facilities as well. I would liken that maybe more so to an AGM, assistant general manager, but you don't have food and beverage under you. But you're starting to see superintendents who become AGMs because they want to move up into the GM role.
Yeah. You make an interesting point, and I think it's something that, certainly at my point in life and my age, a lot of the guys that I grew up with as superintendents are getting to that, 50, 60-year-old mark. And that's that bullseye gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's frightening for a lot of folks that are, in that age group. And then you see all the stories, the horrible stories of, the 55, 60-year-old superintendent had been there for 30 years and they decided they were going to go in another direction. And like you said, it's not easy at that age to find a superintendent's job, but that's not the case for the general manager. I mean, every time you see a job opening come across your desk, it's, there's 5 GMs. So, I mean, it just makes sense, right? To have that, in your back pocket.
I think so. I mean, when clubs hire superintendents, they always think of a young person. They always want somebody young, it seems like. And with the physical ability, even though I don't think superintendents from a physical ability standpoint anymore have to do any of the work.
Right.
They've got an equipment manager and maybe an equipment technician. They've got 2 assistants now where they used to have 1.
Yeah.
But trying to find a job at 55 it's tough.
It sucks.
Superintendent trying to find a job at 55 or 60 for a GM. There's GMs that are working into their 70s now. Because there's not that physical part of it that's
right. And experience counts.
Yeah, and the older you get, the more experience I think you have.
So let me talk to you about what kind of coaching are you doing? And, this is one of those things, and I think you know this, but I spent between the time I was a county agent and when I started Earthworks back a million years ago, I was a recruiter for 5 years. And, and there's a lot of stories. Let me first ask you, do you have any good stories of interviews that went awry and people told you things that they shouldn't have? I mean, you don't have to mention any names, but there's got to be some good stories, either in your superintendent career, or GM career, or in any.
I think the most unique one was I do a lot of Zoom interviews. I probably Zoom interview 20 people initially for every position I have.
Wow.
And I do it because I get to know a lot of people, and they're only going to hire one person. So there's 19 or 20 others that are left. I interviewed a guy for a position, and I always tell him to dress casual for the Zoom interviews because it's just me.
Right.
And there's this guy, he's got a coat and tie on. I mean, he's got a white shirt with a suit or a tie on. And he leans back during the Zoom interview, and I realized the guy's wearing red underwear and no pants.
He's not smart enough to keep it from here up.
No. Yeah, it's like a TV reporter. They say, some of them wear jeans, but they got the sport coat on and the tie. Well,
right.
This guy
should be okay. Red underwear, not so good.
This guy was, well, just underwear with no pants is not so good, but that was an odd one.
First of all, he must have been doing one of these things where he was looking up at the ceiling and he fell over backwards so you could see everything. So it must be that badly.
Well, you could move your laptop like this and this, and his was more coming down here, and he leaned back to think about something, and boom. So
there you go. That's a great story. We don't have in our industry, and you mentioned this, a lot of guys just don't interview well. And we don't really have anywhere for a superintendent to go to learn how to interview. And I know when I was a recruiting manager, I spent a lot of time, coaching people on how to interview, some tricks of the trade, but we don't really have that as an industry. And it's unfortunate. And as many guys as I do that are or potentially are great superintendents or even good general managers, but just can't talk their way out of a paper bag. And, I can think of a dozen guys that, have always come in second or, third for a good job. And you kind of know that it's just their technique. Are you now doing a lot of that coaching for a candidate to take a job? I mean, how do you help somebody through the interview process?
Well, I mean, for us, they're going to take a facility tour before they interview. So when they're done with the tour, I sit and talk with them before they go into the interview. I'll give them some tips. I always tell them what the first question I'm going to ask them is. And so they're pre-warned about that. So they have a few minutes to think that over. But I think about, I used to interview horribly because I'm a quiet person, and I'd go into interviews and I just wouldn't talk enough about myself versus
really.
Oh yeah, it's just horrible. I've been second 6 times.
I never knew that, Pat.
Twice I got the offer for the position. I've only accepted once, and that was the Olympic Club. I was second for the superintendent position. I was second for the first time when I interviewed for GM. To me, it's more about being yourself and being comfortable and practicing. I think the fact that I was fortunate enough at the Olympic Club, they allowed me to get on the GCSA board of directors. You do a lot of preparation with GCSA about how to do interviews, about how to present yourself. Some people are natural with that and they're really great, and others aren't. And for those that aren't, you gotta get out and practice. And Zoom's a great way to do it. Practice with somebody else, get in front of a camera, which is very hard to do if you've never done it in your life.
So do it on a platform like we're doing now on a Zoom platform, just to be able to talk to somebody.
Yeah, I mean, do it with your spouse. Do it with a friend. Do it with a coworker. Do it with another superintendent, where you just interview each other and get comfortable at answering questions.
Yeah, that's a very good insight. I mean, I never even thought about that. And I would assume, like you were saying, you're doing a lot of Zoom interviews. So a lot of interviewing these days are through this, especially since COVID hit. A lot of the interviews are through a platform like this. So and it is a little bit different, and and it can be a little intimidating.
It is, but I think the more you do it, as with anything, the more comfortable you're doing it, and the more honest you get with it. If you don't do interviews very often, or Zoom interviews, and you get asked a question, some people sort of offer answers. And I think I'm always going to ask somebody, what's the worst day you've ever had on the job? Tell me about a bad day at work, because I want to hear how you react and how did you react to that.
How do you react? Yeah, of course.
Because it's always how you react. Everybody has a bad day, but what do you do? What do you do to relieve stress at work?
Well, I throw things against the wall and scream and yell at people. How's that?
Well, there's nobody.
Might be honest, but probably won't get me a job.
No, but it's it's all about personal behavior and about how you react to
Yeah.
situations, how they affect you.
I assume you're vetting. I mean, if you're looking at a candidate, you probably know a lot about them before you even start the interview process. I mean, you've done some vetting, talking to people, I mean, how do you do that? Or do you do that?
No, we do that. I mean, if you look at GM positions, my guess is when you advertise that position, we probably only get 3 out of 10 people that apply for it. The other 7 we have to go recruit.
Really? Okay.
The superintendent position I'm working on now, I sent out 35 emails to superintendents. And I usually don't ask if they're interested. I ask if they know somebody that's interested. That would be a candidate I should talk to. And invariably, half of those people come back and say, well, maybe I'm interested.
Yeah, I could be interested in that.
Yeah. And so, it's a way of getting people to pique their interest and their curiosity about a position.
Yeah. What's the life expectancy of a GM right now?
I think it's 3.7, 3.8 years.
Why is it so low?
It's a tough job to start with.
Yeah.
If you look at a board of directors, superintendent works for the GM. If the GM stays there 5 years, you have one boss.
Yeah.
A GM has a board of directors. If it's 9 or 12, they probably turn over every 3 or 4 years. In my case, at the Olympic Club, 3 years after I became GM, about one board member was left. I had only board members.
Wow.
And you think about board members that some get on boards for good reasons. Some get on boards because they want power. They want to change something.
Or they're pissed off at somebody and want to get back.
Yeah. And I mean, in our case, I think our average placement stays about 8 years, which I think is great. The fact that we really vet people. We search for candidates that are a culture fit with the club, and the club's a culture fit with the candidate.
Yeah.
But again, we can't guarantee who's going to be on the board 4 or 5 years later.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the challenge of a superintendent too, because the potential for somebody coming after you for whatever silly reason. What's the life expectancy of a superintendent these days?
Oh, I think superintendents are up in their 8 to 10 years. I'm amazed at some that have been around 15, 20 years on jobs.
Yeah.
Which is extremely hard. I just can't imagine being a superintendent at the same place for 20 years. I'm not criticizing anybody that does it, but
yeah, I know.
Moving around for me was great, and always challenging yourself. But some are just happy where they're at, which is great. Well.
And it's funny because as you travel around and you do this as much as I do or more, you run into guys. I mean, I have some dear friends, I'll reference my friend John Chassard at Lehigh Country Club. He's been there for, I don't know, 40, 80, 100 years. I don't know. And half of his crew have been there for 30 years, and I've known them all since, I've been in this business for 35 and they were all there when I got there. And that's rare. I mean, that's culture, and that's a good management team above him, and he's changed. He's had a GM or two since he's been in there, but they've been able to keep them for for a period of time. So it's kind of unique and a challenging. What's it's funny. I keep wanting to go back to helping people figure out how to get through the interview process, and I remember when I was a recruiting manager, I was always trying to suggest, make sure you turn any negative question that somebody's going to ask into a positive. And it just seems, and I guess I want to ask you if this is still true. In the days that I did this, and this was going back a ways, it just seemed like anybody that was interviewing was always trying to find a reason not to hire you, because it's always easier to say no to a candidate than to take the risk of hiring somebody and hoping they work out well. So they're always asking you these silly questions, that are showing you red flags that are saying, oh, well, he answered that question badly. And I reference one that I always loved and I always used as that example was, they ask you a question like, do you like to do paperwork? Well, that's a stupid ass question. Nobody likes to do paperwork. So I kept saying, so here's the answer. If, when they ask you something stupid like that, say, no, I hate to do paperwork, but because I don't like to do it, I do it very quickly and very efficiently. So I get it off my desk and I don't have to come back and do it again. Boom. Turned a negative into a positive.
That's a great attitude. I mean, a great answer.
Yeah.
A lot of people will go, what's your weakest trait or something like that.
Yeah.
And if you give up your weakest trait and you don't follow up and say, I've learned from that, I've progressed from there, you killed yourself in the interview, I think.
Yeah, that's one of those questions you should be prepared for when you go in, because
Right.
somebody will probably ask you something like that. And it has to be, they're asking you for a negative. They're asking you to give, tell me a reason not to hire you. Why should I not hire you? Well,
That's right.
my worst trait is I yell and scream and I throw things at everybody, so I don't think that's a problem. I mean, I haven't hurt anybody yet. I mean, I would hope nobody would say that. Although we know a lot of superintendents that act that way. So yeah, it's silly.
Well, it is, and I think it's really changed post-COVID what clubs are looking for,
Yeah.
especially private clubs. So many private clubs had a waiting list to get in before COVID, and then they filled up during COVID because it became the safe haven for the family.
Yeah.
And a lot of clubs have really progressed from being golf clubs to family clubs now. And I think superintendents need to understand that as well, because it's just not a golf club anymore. It's a club for the family to go to, the
Right.
kids to go to. So you got to think of it in a different way.
And you got to manage that clientele a little bit differently, because now you do have kids and families, and
There's a whole different expectation.
and those kids in 15, 20 years could become the president of the club, and they could come back and fire your tail between that
Well,
time.
I never stayed long enough to have that happen.
Right now, but I've seen that before.
Oh,
Let's talk about that, because you bring up a good point. What are the trends now in the golf course market that you're seeing? I mean, that's a good example of one. And I've seen that all over the country where, there's a long waiting list since COVID, and families are coming to the clubs, and you're seeing, swimming and tennis and now pickleball and all the goodies. How does that affect the superintendent? And then how does that affect the general manager?
Well, I think from a superintendent's perspective, you're still hired to run the golf course. So you got to run the golf course, the agronomic portion, with as good as you always did in the past. But you're going to get pulled into different things. You may have a movie night out on the golf course that they never had in the past.
Yeah.
You may have different types of functions that involve golf course acreage that have nothing to do with golf, because the GM wants to have some type of family program. Club I did down in Arizona in Phoenix had an Easter egg hunt with 10,000 eggs on the 18th fairway. I mean,
10,000 eggs on a fairway?
Yep. I mean, on a hole, the 18th hole. So it's probably 200, 300, 400 kids running around out on your golf course. So you got to think of, what are the ramifications of that? So it's not just pure golf. It's becoming a family oriented place to go. I think the expectations of the family are quite different. It used to be the husband set the expectations. Now could be the wife, or it could be vice versa. It could be the wife that sets the expectations, and the husband's fine with everything.
Yeah.
Food and beverage now has become big at clubs again. Everybody wants a great meal. Everybody wants a casual outlet. Outdoor dining is huge everywhere because of COVID.
Yeah. Is food and beverage actually getting better? I mean, I know over the last 20 years, we all bitched about, it was just a drag on the club, but it's changing, hasn't it?
Well, it's the outlet, I think, is changing.
Yeah.
It's more the fine dining's gone, but I want the food I got in fine dining in a casual atmosphere. And I might want it outside. So you're seeing all these stuff adding up to meeting suites, or however they want to do it, because people just like that freedom. You saw the restaurants in these major cities had to provide outdoor dining during COVID.
Yeah.
People got used to that without a straight.
And the golf clubs usually have it. I mean, it's usually an easy outlet for, there's a patio or something.
You're seeing the 35 to 45-year-old crowd, mostly male, that play golf 2 or 3 times a week because of COVID. They figured out how to work from home.
Right.
They figured out that they can play golf 3 times during the week. But the
working from home.
Well, but I think people that work from home, I look at it now and I'm working from home, but I'm working from home 7 days a week.
Yeah, exactly. I've been doing that for 35 years, so I get it. Yeah, you work when you work, and you don't when you don't.
It's not an 8 to 4 o'clock and then you shut it off. I mean, I'll do Zoom interviews on weeks, but you look at that crowd, that 35 to 45 and 50-year-old male crowd at clubs, and they all want a great trendy bar. So you're seeing change their bars. You're seeing clubs get rid of their men's dining area, getting rid of their men's card room.
Yeah.
It's a lot more family oriented, but I think it's great for the club business.
So what does that mean to the general manager if somebody's looking into that kind of a position? Obviously, they're initiating a lot of this change, I would assume, knowing that the demographic is changing. I mean, that has to be something you look for when you're looking at a GM, is understanding the changes in the industry.
Certainly, but it all depends on the club you're representing. Some clubs are the old-fashioned club that they don't want to change; they want to jam and to come in and keep the status quo. There's other clubs that had a wait list or didn't have a wait list, have a wait list now, and it's all family oriented. So they're looking for a club or a GM that can come in and reinvent the club. A lot of clubs don't know who they want to be when they grow up.
Yeah.
Most of it's family programming that's taking place now.
So when you get an opportunity to recruit for a general manager from a club you're not familiar with, I assume one of the first things you're doing is getting on a plane and interviewing the club, or at least going out there and learning their culture, right?
Absolutely. So what first thing we'll do is have a senior staff meeting. We'll meet with senior staff, talk about issues at the club, and that's always the most interesting meeting, because you'll see who is not afraid to speak up, and you'll see others that are totally afraid to speak up, and then we break them apart and go one by one with them, and you really find out what's going on at the club, because when you get them in one and you let them know we're not going to tell the search committee or the board what you said individually, but we'll present it in the aggregate.
Right.
In that case, a lot of them start to speak up. And at some clubs, it's great. At other clubs, there's a lot going on that's not good.
Yeah.
But that helps us understand what type of GM to come in to bring in. Do we need a person to maintain the status quo, or do we need somebody to come in and reinvent the club? Sometimes they need a GM that needs to really mentor staff.
Would you ever turn a job down after that interview, having some concerns about the team?
I haven't done it long enough to say that.
Yeah.
I bet if you asked Dan Denehy, he'd probably say, "Yeah, I probably should."
I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, again, you're representing, me or whoever, you might be representing that might be a potential, employee there, and you're not going to want to stick them in a place that is going to be a disaster. So, do you ever have to have a conversation with these people at the club that you're interviewing and saying, look, you got to, if you want to recruit top quality people, I mean, do you have an opportunity to help them discover some changes that they might need to or want to take hold of?
Yeah, after that first day's meeting, we meet with the search committee or the board or a combination of them. We'll let them know what we think is going on at the club and either validate that or tell us we're crazy. And sometimes we have to come back a month later and say, "You're wrong. This is what's really happening with your management.
Yeah,
you need to make some changes. We need to look for this certain type of GM for you, and somebody that can come in and correct the show."
yeah. You probably hate this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But what does it look like, and moving forward for salaries for superintendents and then for GMs? Are they getting better? Are they stable? Are they flat? Or I mean, where do we look in the next 5 years? Are we still in a growth position as an industry?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think people have rediscovered clubs,
Good.
and I'm not speaking private clubs, but even they've rediscovered golf. I mean, you look at Top Golf, you look at simulators.
Yeah.
Everybody's playing golf. They might not be playing it good, and that they've associated that golf experience with food and beverage now at Top Golf. So people join clubs, and they may not play golf, but they play pickleball, they play whatever they're going to play, and it's that club atmosphere. I look at GMs. I've run across a number of GMs who just quit for 6 months, which I've never seen in the past, where a GM will quit without another job. But it's hard to get GMs, so they know they can get rehired very quickly.
Why are they quitting?
They're just burnt out post COVID. I mean, people.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's just a little too much.
Such high expectations, and the members tend to think that you didn't have to work that hard during COVID, and really, GMs have to reinvent their clubs.
Yeah,
they're doing takeout food and everything. But I look at it. GM salaries are going up quite a bit. Superintendent salaries for the better superintendents at the better clubs and those that are willing to take on more responsibility, as we've talked about,
Yeah.
I think they're making a lot more money. I've seen some salary surveys at some top clubs in a certain city that really surprised me recently.
Oh, good, good, good. So
Yeah,
there's
so
the future.
I think superintendents are in a great position.
So I'm going to end with this because I know you've got a time restraint here, but where do we find new people? I mean, that's the first question I get when I talk to anybody. Do you know anybody? Where do I find an assistant? Where, you used to have 700 resumes for any superintendent's job. And now, if you find 10, you're lucky. I mean, what's the future of that?
I think we're at the bottom of this shortage of assistants because what's happening now, I'm seeing some assistant superintendent jobs go for $100,000 to $120,000.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
It is, and what's going to happen sooner or later, you're going to see some young people think I can make $120,000 working outside. That's not a bad job.
Yeah, and not heavy responsibility as an assistant.
Well, it's pretty good responsibility, but on the other hand, it's one you enjoy. I think what's going to happen is the market's going to catch up with the raising assistant superintendent salaries, and you're going to start seeing some people come back into the field that left the field.
Oh, good.
I think so. I think, in the GM position, as I said, we have to go out and find people. We have to find people for superintendent positions because they just don't apply for jobs anymore. And I think, I also think post-COVID, and this is going to end, but you have superintendents and GMs that have their life, disrupted so dramatically because of COVID that they just want to remain where they're at for 4 or 5 years. Their kids got, their life changed, and they don't want to move. They don't want to change the surroundings for their kids, for their spouse. But I think that'll all change in another couple of years.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. I mean, this whole COVID thing, nobody really understands, and it's very strange. But it's still a big question: is how do we keep the labor force going in the golf industry? And obviously, you're seeing many companies like yours, Denehy, that are out there and obviously really taking charge of this, which is wonderful. So, Pat, I know you're busy, and I know you've got, I guess, another interview to take care of. I'm grateful that you took some time and shared with us your thoughts. And how do people find you if they want to find you?
It's very easy. It's Denehy, or it's Patrick at DenehyCTP.com. You can always go to the GCSA directory if you're a GCSA member and find me, but it's not too hard.
I looked you up on LinkedIn real fast just to get some information before the interview. It was easy to find Denehy, and you popped right up. So, you're not hard to find. So if somebody's looking for some help there, I would obviously encourage them. Somebody with your experience and personality trait. I'm grateful, my friend, as always. Hopefully, when you get back to Connecticut, you look me up and we can find some time to hang out somewhere. But thank you so much.
I will do it, Joel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pat. And folks, that is the Earthworks podcast. Please subscribe and join us next week. We'll have more interesting people, maybe not as interesting as Mr. Finlen, but we'll have more people or more folks back on next week. Thank you so much. Thanks, Pat. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Joel.